And so the next category of macromolecule that we're going to discuss are the lipids, or the fats. And so the lipids are actually very varied in their structure. But there is one common hallmark that all lipids share, and that is that they are hydrophobic, or that they're water-fearing, and they don't dissolve easily in water. And lipids can have many different functions. They can function in long-term energy storage, they can provide structure, they can help insulate and retain heat, they can help communicate between cells as well as regulate other processes, and they can provide protection. And so just like their structures, their functions are varied as well. You can see here some of the different functions of different types of lipids, and we're going to go into each of these different types in the next couple slides. So we're going to start with the fats and the oils, or the triglycerides, which is just a fancy word for fats and oils. And triglycerides function in long-term energy storage, and they do also provide some insulation. And all triglycerides have the same basic structure. They have one molecule of glycerol, which you can see here in kind of the teal box, and then they have 3 fatty acids attached to that glycerol molecule. And so that's the tri in triglycerides, and that's the glyc right here, right? So you've got 3 fatty acids, tri, attached to 1 glycerides. And the fatty acids can all be the same, they can all be different, as you see here. And once again, you don't need to know these structures, it's just to sort of illustrate the point. And depending on the fatty acids that are attached to the glycerol molecule, that determines which fat or which triglyceride you're talking about. And those fatty acid tails, the ones that hang off of the glycerol molecule, can be what's known as unsaturated, or they can be saturated. And when I say saturated, I don't mean covered in water, but what I do mean is covered in hydrogens, right? And so if you look down here at this fatty acid, you can see a long chain of carbons, right? So this is an organic molecule. And what you'll notice is that every single carbon has 2 hydrogens on it, right? It's completely saturated or covered in hydrogens. And that saturation with hydrogen means that there's no double bonds forming between these carbons, and it makes these nice long straight chains that you can see over here in this black and white model on the right. And because there are no double bonds between the carbons in a saturated fat, and saturated fatty acids are so straight, they actually stack up really easily inside larger molecules. And you can stack a lot of saturated fats or fatty acids on top of each other, and they lie flat, right? And they lie flat on top of each other and stack together like Legos and make a very solid structure, which is why saturated fats tend to be solid at room temperature. And some examples of saturated fats are butter and lard. And this is the chemistry behind why those particular fats that have a lot of saturated fatty acids are solid at room temperature. And this is slightly different for the fats that are liquid at room temperature, like olive oils and peanut oils, because they contain triglycerides with unsaturated fatty acids. And unsaturated means that there's not 2 hydrogens on every single carbon in this long chain. And so you can see here highlighted in yellow and red some double bonded carbons. And what double bonded carbons do to a molecule is they basically kink it up, or they make bends in it. And so rather than a nice long straight chain like a saturated fatty acid would be, the fatty acids on this triglyceride here in black and white are actually kinked or bent. And that kinky bended structure means that these triglycerides can't lay nicely on top of each other and fit together like those of a saturated fatty acids, right? And trying to lay a bunch of crinkled up, folded up stuff on top of each other is going to be unstable. And that's what leads to these types of fats being liquid at room temperature. The next category of lipids we're going to discuss is a type called phospholipids. And phospholipids are one lipid that provides some structure, at least in terms of cells. And they have a similar structure to that of triglycerides. They have a glycerol molecule, and they have fatty acid tails, but they also contain a phosphate group. That's why they're known as the phospholipids. And what that phosphate group does is it actually changes the chemical properties of this lipid. And so we recall from the beginning of this lecture that all lipids are hydrophobic. And that is true of phospholipids as well, except that hydrophobicness or hydrophobicity is localized only to the tails or the fatty acids. Once we add that phosphate group to the glycerol molecule over here, we actually turn it from water-fearing or hydrophobic to water-loving or hydrophilic, because phosphate groups are charged and water likes to dissolve charged things. And phospholipids have this unique property where that one side, this head group here, this circular ball, is hydrophilic and water-loving, whereas the fatty acid tails are hydrophobic or water-fearing. And this is fortunate for us because the function of phospholipids is to form the plasma membranes or the outside membranes of all of our cells. And this works because having molecules like this in water will result in formation of what's known as a lipid bilayer, or basically a layer of two lipids, two layers of phospholipids. And that's because once you put phospholipids in water, those water-fearing fatty acid tails are all going to clump together and try and get away from all of the water, whereas those hydrophilic, water-loving heads are fine with water, and so they can face out either into the environment or to the inside of the cell, both of which are water, and everything is totally fine. And so you have this structure where there are two layers of phospholipids with the heads pointing outwards towards the water, and the tails pointing inwards to form kind of a hydrophobic core. In addition to providing structure, there's a group of lipids called the steroids that can function as hormones or regulators of different functions in the body. And one of those is kind of example steroids is cholesterol. The sex hormones, testosterone and estrogen, are also steroids. And cholesterol can actually serve as the precursor or kind of the beginning step to make several other steroids. And cholesterol is a pretty large molecule. You can see it down here on the left. And as a lipid, it does not dissolve easily in water. And our blood is mostly made of water, right? And so cholesterol, when levels get too high within the blood, the cholesterol can't dissolve, but it sort of has to go somewhere. And so what you can see here is a normal artery that over time has cholesterol molecules that should be dissolved in the blood but can't, actually sticking to the inside of arteries and blood vessels and collecting there until that artery gets very narrowed. And that's what leads to circulatory disorders. It can lead to high blood pressure and it can lead to heart attack. And that's because cholesterol is a fat, right? And so it doesn't dissolve in the blood, and it also is relatively sticky. And so in addition to its hormone function, it can also cause some issues, especially within the cardiovascular system or your heart and blood vessels. And finally, the last group of lipids that we're going to talk about are the ones that provide protection, and these are known as waxes. Waxes are always solid at room temperature, and they provide protection by being waterproof, as well as being relatively resistant to degradation or destruction. And so you can see waxes on the outsides of fruit skin, as well as in this honeycomb structure here on the right. And as you know, on the outside of a fruit, water will bead up so that water can't actually leach into the fruit, and also so that it's not lost from the fruit to the outside environment, which protects the seeds or the embryos of the plant within the fruit. And it's also relatively hard to degrade a wax, which is good for the bees because their home is actually this wax honeycomb, right? So it helps that it's resistant to degradation.